All right, well, I'm excited to introduce our speaker this week, Dr. Karin Burghardt, who's in the entomology department. We have traded a seminar, so I gave a seminar over there a couple weeks ago. Now she's here. So Dr. Burghardt did her undergrad at University of Delaware, and worked with Doug Tallamy as an undergrad. Some of you all may recognize that name of doing some urban nature and people in nature sort of work. Then did a master's and PhD at Yale in ecology and evolution biology under Oz Smith, who's also very famous in the sort of species interaction and predator-prey sort of area. And then postdoc at the Smithsonian Ecological Research Center with John Parker. And now, since 2008, has been at University of Maryland in the entomology department as an associate professor. And excited to hear about bugs and plant interactions in urban areas. So,
yeah, thanks for the invite. I've been here since 2018, not 2008.
My notes said 2018.
I've got a
Sorry
few
about
extra years there. But yeah, I'm super excited to kind of walk across campus and give a talk to you all. Hopefully, there are already some insect fans in the audience, but hopefully by the end there will be more. Mostly what my lab does is we focus on plant-insect interactions. So we study plants as much as we study insects, and we actually study the things that eat the insects as well. So we're really interested in a more community ecology perspective. And so these plant-insect interactions, kind of typically the ones that our lab are focusing on are trophic interactions. So this is who eats whom. And I got really interested in this when I was starting to actually work in Doug Tallamy's lab, and just watching how different types of insects figured out how to feed on different plant parts. So you can have insects that are feeding on the external parts of leaves, but you also have plenty of insects that have hypodermic needle type mouth parts that suck out phloem sap, or xylem, actually even highly pressurized xylem sap. And you have lots of really specialized relationships where there are insects that have basically tapped into the hormonal pathways of plants to trick them into making homes for them, like these gall wasps. There's a little larval wasp kind of hanging out inside of this plant tissue. So this is kind of the basic interaction that my lab focuses on. And we really are interested in this insect piece because insects are an integral part of food webs. I like insects in general because they have this duality. They are sometimes pests of humans and also can cause lots of economic damage or even medical harm through diseases that are transmitted by insects. But then they also are doing a lot of things for us as humans that are really beneficial. And they really form the basis of a lot of the transfer of energy from plants that are the primary producers and are producing sugars on the landscape. And these caterpillars and other insects that feed on those plants are basically transferring that energy up to higher trophic levels like birds, foxes, mammals, many of the species that we tend to think of as wildlife. Although I will note these insects are wildlife too. We can get into that argument if you want. But the insects are actually 9 times the biomass of the mammals and birds we have in the landscape. They're really important for feeding breeding bird populations. So most of our terrestrial bird species feed their young insects. I love this stat, which is that even things like grizzly bears and foxes will often feed on insects for a large portion of their life cycle as well. So these insects are really important to functioning ecosystems. And in our human landscapes, they're also doing other stuff for us that we often don't recognize them for. So you actually need to have plant-feeding insects in the landscape in order to support natural enemies, to prevent pest outbreaks, and provide alternative prey sources for some of your predators. Pollination is talked about a lot. I'm not going to be focusing on that at all during this talk, but I think an overlooked aspect what insects do for us is that they also contribute a lot to nutrient cycling. And in addition to moving nutrients and energy up the food web to higher trophic levels, they're also defecating, contributing carcasses, creating tunnels in soil, breaking down materials, and contributing a lot to nutrient cycles in our landscapes. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the talk. So just a couple more terms that I might throw out here because we are focused on trophic interactions, is a lot of the talk's going to be focused on plant feeding insects. And I just want to point out for folks that are less familiar with some of our plant feeders, we have an extraordinarily diverse community of insects that feed on plants, and only a very small portion of those species are ever kind of considered pests. And so pests basically means they harm us as humans in some way, and it's a really small fraction. The rest of these guys are out here doing their thing on the landscape, often aren't really noticed, even by humans. And then I might mention these terms like natural enemies or predators. And basically, these are things that are going to eat our plant feeders. And in this talk, predators are going to be organisms that eat lots of different prey items over the course of their lives. So this is birds, they feed lots of individual caterpillars. This is a syrphid larva, so a flower fly that's a pollinator as an adult, but actually as larvae, they are kind of voracious aphid predators. If you've ever had a garden or grown milkweed, anywhere you see an aphid outbreak, just look for these guys and you will find them pretty much. And also, this is a trash gatherer lacebug predator that puts lots of little pieces of lichen and bark on their back and then runs around. So if you ever see a little piece of wood crawling around on a tree trunk, flip it over and you'll probably find one of these little lacebug larvae. Parasitoids are the other group that I'm going to be talking about throughout the talk, and these are organisms that tend to only feed on one individual over the course of their life cycle. They tend to be insects, so we're going to mostly be talking about wasps that are parasitoids. Think alien, where an egg gets laid inside of an insect, and then instead of getting that insect coming out in their next molt, you get an adult wasp. And that's exactly what's happened with this aphid right here. We call these aphid mummies, and they're basically all these brown aphids had a wasp egg laid inside, and then here the wasp has emerged. This is what a normal aphid of this species looks like. So these are kind of some groups of different organisms I'm going to be talking about throughout the talk, just so we're on the same page. So what my lab does is basically look at these plant-insect interactions, but does it in the context of human management, and tries to figure out if we can take some of the principles from ecological theory to support biodiversity and ecosystem services kind of where humans live. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for this because humans love to mess with plants. We like to move them places, we like to plant them, we like to manipulate them. And so we're already doing this as a species. And so if we can figure out ways to kind of support these diverse food webs, we're already putting effort into the landscape, and we can make tweaks to increase the support of biodiversity. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking through three vignettes about different ways that human management potentially can influence plant-insect interactions. And hopefully I will get through all of them. I know this is kind of a short, condensed slot, so I'll check in on the time and we'll see. So the first one I want to talk about is landscaping and insect life cycles. And so I threw this one in because this particular vignette is really useful for this time of year. And I think that, especially if you're not an entomologist, when you tend to notice insects on the landscape is when they are kind of adults, and they are big, and they are flashy, and you can get nice pictures of them. This is a Cecropia moth, which is one of our larger moth species around here. But also we have things like rose malabees. Has anybody found one of these rose malabees? Do you have a hibiscus in your yard anywhere? If you do, actually we have a lot of these being planted in rain gardens now. So if you're walking by a rain garden next like June or July, look in the flowers for these bees, because they're specialists just on rose mallow, and the rose mallow flowers only last for about a day or two, but the males guard the flowers to wait for a female to come. And so you will often find almost like a bee per flower if you have one of these plants on your landscape. But what these guys are doing at that flower is they're waiting to mate with the female. The female is going to gather this pollen. She's going to make a pollen ball, and she's going to dig a hole in the ground and put that pollen ball in there and then lay an egg on the pollen ball. And that pollen ball is going to feed the larvae that will then emerge the next year. And so this adult stage that we tend to notice of this adult is only there for a few weeks of the year. The rest of the year is spent kind of underground, using a totally different habitat, and nobody would really have any idea it was there, right? And so the other stage we sometimes notice with these guys is if they're kind of eating plants that we want to eat. This is the other stage we might notice these. But what I'm going to be talking about for this part of the talk is really other stages of insect life cycles that aren't as obvious to us. And so if you have, say, an adult Luna moth, we notice these guys. Has anybody seen a Luna moth in real life? Yeah? Like beautiful, amazing creatures. They don't actually feed as adults even, so they're not around for very long. But they lay eggs on things like hickories or sweet gums, and the larva will feed for 3-4 weeks before they pupate. And these guys pupate often by rolling themselves into a leaf and making a cocoon. So the pupa is inside of a cocoon. And in the fall, what happens is that they fall off the leaves fall off the tree, and then you have a cocoon sitting underneath the tree. In the spring, the adult is going to emerge and go and find another host. But what do we do in a lot of the habitats that we inhabit? We don't actually like leaving leaves on the ground, right? We move them around. And so these are some of the different places where our actions as humans intersect with the life cycles of many of these insects. And we don't tend to think about these other stages of insects. We might plant pollinator flowers, but we don't often think about kind of where these guys are going in the winter. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is one of the things we tend to like to do around this time of year, which is remove all of the leaves that fall down off of the trees, and think about what this might mean for some of our insect communities. And so this is work that was headed up by my grad student, Max Berlato. He has graduated at this point and is actually now the Maryland State entomologist, working for the Department of Natural Resources. Amazingly, there's only one person in the Department of Natural Resources that focuses on insects. A lot more people focus on deer. But he was really interested when he started in my lab in thinking about this question. What happens to all of this yard waste and leaves that fall down every year and are removed? What does this kind of giant movement of resources mean for insect communities? And this is a huge amount of material, 35 million tons, which is kind of crazy. And the key piece here is that many of our boreal insects, so things like moths, butterflies, predators, actually will overwinter below ground or in the leaf litter itself. Even though they spend most of the time that you would see them out in the landscape up in the trees, on foliage. So they're plant feeding in their larval stages, but they need a safe place to overwinter when it gets cold. So the two ways that kind of removing leaves in the fall might have an impact on your insect populations are that they could directly kill them. So like that Luna moth I was talking about, if you rake up that hickory leaf and send it to the landfill, hopefully you're sending it to some kind of composting. But in a lot of places that doesn't actually exist. So either way, that Luna moth is probably not coming out in the spring, right? There's a kind of a second path that Max was interested in, which was that the other thing that leaves are really important for in forests and ecosystems in general is they're forming a thermal buffer layer over the soil, right? So it's almost like a blanket. And so soil temperatures might change either in how cold they get or in their fluctuations over the course of the day if you remove this kind of layer of leaves. So if you think about an insect that tends to burrow into the soil, pupate there, and then hang out for the winter, they're going to be getting many very different temperature cues if all of a sudden their blanket has been taken off of them. So these were the two pathways that you might imagine leaf removal affecting these insects. And so his work was focused on using 20 yards across Maryland, primarily in the suburbs. So Columbia is just right up the road, and then we actually had a number of houses that volunteered in neighborhoods right around here. So some in University Park, Calvert Hills, in this area. And so what he did was design an experiment to ask some questions about what leaf removal meant for these insect communities. And so he did a manipulative experiment where he went to low maintenance areas of the yard. So these are places where people historically have actually left leaves. So he found yards where people had areas they left them and areas they historically removed them, and then kind of did the opposite treatment in each area. So in the backyard, people usually would leave a space of leaves, and then in that case, he would manipulate them by removing leaves from an area in fall. And then in the front yard, in these areas we call high maintenance, they typically would be raked, there might be garden bed or lawn. There he would leave leaves where they fell. And then basically in the spring, once the soil temperature started warming up, he would install these emergence traps on top of those leaves, and then just collect insects every 10 days or so that emerged in each of these areas. And he did this for 2 years. So this is what these kind of traps look like. And we put up some signage so that people wouldn't be like, think this was too crazy in people's yards. The folks who volunteered for this study, I think, were appreciative there was some kind of sign to explain why this was happening. These traps cover about a fifth of a square meter, so they're not very large. And so one of the questions, just to start with, is whether yards are important habitat for insects. And this was actually something reviewers gave us a very hard time about. Like, are suburbs even good for insects? And this is a very small area, like a fifth of a meter. This is quite small, but we are getting, over the course of the season, 200 to 300 to even 400 insects emerging from that small area. So they are finding these spaces and they are using them as overwintering habitat. If we just look at all of the insects that are emerging, we are seeing that leaving your leaves does increase, in general, the total number of insects that are emerging kind of from these areas. So that's the basic first pattern. But I will say, and I'll show you the rest of the results, a lot of these are going to be little tiny flies. Not mosquitoes, but lots of little tiny flies. And so we're gonna break this down more by kind of groups of interest that I was talking about before. So first of all, we were interested in moths and butterflies. Our lab loves caterpillars. And so he was very interested in what's happening with the Lepidoptera. And basically, Lepidoptera do really seem to care about if they have a leaf litter substrate left on the ground. So in both the low and the high maintenance yards, you're gonna see a number of these plots. We saw increases in the number of Lepidoptera that emerge in the spring if you have left leaves in the fall in that habitat. And we can talk a little bit more about this interesting pattern between high and low maintenance, but mostly I'm just going to be showing you what these other patterns are. So he also found, so that was abundance. So we're getting more moths and butterflies using this habitat if there's leaves. But also, if you look at the richness of the species that are using these habitats, you see that these two purple and pink filled circles are the two leaf addition plots, and these consistently had more species that we found using them. So there's a more diverse group of species that are coming out of plots that have leaves left. And when he kind of dove in and tried to figure out what are the traits associated with the species that are found in plots that have leaves left, you're basically picking up a lot of things you might expect. So leaf mining species, these are species that feed inside in between the layers of the tissue of leaves, and often leave those kind of cool tracks you'll see in the fall that'll stay green on a leaf. That life history trait decreased a lot when you removed leaves. Also ones that overwinter as larvae, and then specifically species that overwinter in fall leaves. So none of this is overly surprising, but nobody had actually looked at any of this before. Yeah, I guess that would have been helpful too to have it earlier. So what about critters that are eating potential pests in this landscape? So these are these ecosystem services that I was talking about, where we have insects that help us control pest outbreaks and pest populations. And so he was interested in these parasitic wasps. Remember, these are those kind of alien-like creatures that are attacking particular insects. And in this case, we don't see very large differences in the overall number of parasitic wasps in places you leave leaves or don't leave leaves. However, when you look at the communities of parasitic wasps, and this is at the family level, for the leps we were looking at species, but parasitic wasps are so diverse and extremely hard to ID that we weren't able to do that. You do see that the plots where you have your leaves left have a very different community of families of these parasitic wasps than do your areas that are raked. And in particular, these areas where leaves are removed and it's a high maintenance area have very different parasitic wasp communities. So there do appear to be differences. However, things like spiders, which are really important natural enemies in a lot of our yard type habitats, they're generalist predators. They have many fewer. You almost have a doubling of spiders in your low maintenance areas of your yard if you have leaves versus if you don't. So they really are responding quite strongly to having that leaf layer. And so this is just a summary of what I've shown you in general. But I want to point out that there's, this is where our Diptera, for example, they're not really very different across our plots, but they're also the dominant part of this community. And these are probably a lot of fungus gnats, very small little critters. However, beetles do seem to care a lot too. So we haven't focused on those, but those are also important predators. They also are plant feeders. So they're a little bit harder to sort out because they do different things in the ecosystem. Okay, so so Max was interested in, okay, what is actually driving these differences in insect communities? And so he did an additional experiment where he manipulated litter either by doubling, kind of piling leaves together. So this would be this addition treatment. Removing leaves, having a control, which is just leaving the leaves that were there, or mulching. This is something that people often do in their yards is they run their lawnmowers over their leaves, or they will use some kind of mulching device. And we were interested in whether this matters as a management tactic. And then he did the same thing in the spring by putting up emergence traps. And he also put out temperature probes, so underground, to try to figure out what these different insects might be experiencing. And sure enough, what you can see is that the more litter you have, so this is more litter, this is less litter, removal. In the addition plots, we have not very large temperature variation in mins and maxes across the days. When we remove the litter, we have way higher variation in the temperatures that probably these overwintering insects are experiencing if they're sitting below ground. So temperature variability is likely playing a role here. And this is just kind of initial data, but particularly for moths and butterflies, mulching isn't really actually any better than removing your leaves, which kind of makes sense if most of them are actually inside the leaves themselves, or probably really care about that temperature that they're experiencing when they emerge. Okay, so I threw this in because this is a environmental studies department. Insect ecosystem services are really important. The support of these insects is really important, but there could be other co-benefits that we have here in yards. And so one of the things that Max was really interested in was whether this is important for nutrient cycling as well. So he also, in these yards, used soil cores and tea bags to quantify the soil carbon and decomposition rates that were in these plots, either that had leaves removed or added. And actually we worked with Stephanie in this department to analyze, to run the analytics on this. So what he found was that it does very much matter whether you leave leaves in your yard, but you have to leave them for lots of years. So basically he found strong differences in whether there were areas of the yard where people had historically been leaving leaves for many years at a time, but the single year manipulations or double year manipulations were not enough to really change either decomposition or percent carbon of the soils. This isn't probably that surprising if you study soil. If you study soils, it can take a long time for those processes to come into play. But I think it's a really interesting contrast with the insects, which immediately kind of switched and were able to find the new habitat. So this work has been published in a couple different places. And actually, Max just had an article that was out in the New York Times a few days ago, last week, about some of this. So if you want to learn more, feel free to check some of these out. Okay, so the summary here is that when you remove these leaves in the fall, you are kind of immediately decreasing the ability of some insects to be able to successfully overwinter, kind of in your yard habitat. And you are seeing changes in the composition of the insects that remain. Those areas of the yard without leaves are still being used by insects, but we never really saw that abundances or overall responses in insect orders were benefited by removing these for the groups we looked at. In terms of our soil processes, we eventually found that removing leaves is going to slow your decomposition and carbon storage, but it's going to take some time in order to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna do a poll, because I kind of don't think I'm gonna get through both of these. These two different topics, I have a tree diversity experiment that we've done a lot of work in, and are interested in how tree diversity is changing communities and food webs. And then we've also done a bit of work on how redlining in Baltimore is changing the street tree community composition. Can we do a vote on which of these two you all would like to hear? Maybe raise your hand for 2. Okay, and 3. Okay, we will go to 3.
Darn.
We'll come back. Okay. So, this is a study that kind of started during the pandemic, and we were interested in how policy and ecology interact. And so I'm gonna tell you a little bit of a story about redlining. How many people are familiar with redlining? I kind of think everybody. I know Travis has done some work on this, and other folks in the department. So I'm not gonna go into it too much, but basically, this policy was implemented in the 30s, and the goal at the time seemed noble. It was to kind of expand the ability of folks to be able to afford homes after the Great Depression, and expand the ability to get homes. And so what's important for this is to remember that neighborhoods were graded from A to D. D was considered red, was colored red on the map, so it's considered riskiest for mortgage investment. And this was done all over the country, and it was sponsored by the federal government through the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but local entities, bankers and appraisers created the maps I'm gonna show you in a minute. So each one, it was individualized to each city. And so this is what one of these maps looks like for Baltimore. So this is the city that I was working in. And so we have best, A, to hazardous. So this is hazardous for getting a loan. And the criteria that were used to determine which of these security zones the mortgage fell into, the problematic piece of this is that often these entities were using racial or ethnic or religious or kind of foreign-born criteria to make decisions about where loans were riskiest. And this had really large impacts on minority populations of all sorts, kind of depending on the city, depending on who was being discriminated against. Because if you owned a home in one of these areas that got redlined, it was very hard for you to sell it because nobody else could get a mortgage. So that was backed by the government in order for them to be able to purchase it. And so your home values declined and cities stopped investing in these areas. From an ecologist perspective, this is interesting because you had a repeated experiment where you had policymakers making decisions for a wide number of US cities all at once. And so there's a spatial component to this because there's a map, we can draw polygons around it, and we also had this happening all over the country in slightly different ways. From kind of ecosystem perspective, what this probably had a large impact on was resource distribution. So this is going to be resources and investment in city services, but also in green spaces, in all the kinds of things that make a place kind of attractive to live in. And so we got interested in this because of this paper that came out by Christopher Schell back in 2001, I think, or 2020. And he pointed out, and his co-authors pointed out, that because there's this resource component and a spatial component to this decision-making process about where mortgages were going to be deemed risky or not, that we could probably imagine that there would be effects on wildlife and the ecology of organisms in cities as a result of this policy. So potentially you could have cities with different redlining decisions, and then that's going to change the trait values of organisms that are living in that city. In this case, we're actually focused on kind of this C piece, which is the communities of organisms that are going to be living in these areas. And so we know that redlining matters for kind of tree cover. There's been a number of studies that have looked at this point, and you can see that neighborhoods that were redlined tend to have lower tree cover across the board from areas of cities that were redlined. But we didn't have any information on whether this mattered for kind of the composition of trees or the diversity of trees that were in these neighborhoods. And that's going to matter for your insects, it's going to matter for the ability of these communities to potentially deal with stress. So diversity is important here because this is one of our strategies for doing integrated pest management. It helps stabilize survival of your population of trees and to decrease susceptibility to, say, oh, I don't know, like emerald ash borer that might come in and hit a huge chunk of your population of trees. This is data from the biodiversity tree experiment, but basically if you plant all of the same tree species in an area, you're basically taking a stock approach versus a mutual fund approach. And you are much more likely to pick a species that might get hit by something down the line and you kind of lose out. You don't have any of your at-risk averaging. So how does this potential policy map to kind of the realized tree communities on the ground? And so what we predicted was that we might have lower diversity in previously redlined neighborhoods, and we might have different occupancy patterns based on historic or recent investments. And so I think street trees are an interesting place to look for this because street trees don't live without humans putting inputs into them. They are definitely a reflection of our human will, our resources, and so we might expect to see patterns here. So what we did was join kind of these two data sets. You can pull redlining maps from this website hosted by University of Richmond for any city in the country, and then we paired this with a street tree survey that was done by Baltimore in 2018. So they mapped 163,000 locations where trees could go. And I think the really key piece here is that these were not just where street trees were already planted, it was also places where there was a vacancy for a street tree. So we know like where there are opportunities to plant trees, but we don't currently have a tree planted. And so this is what the redlining map looks like. When we kind of overlap these maps, we end up with about 90,000 street tree locations, and 50,000 of them are currently housing like a living tree. And so this just shows the distribution of tree sizes. This is a density plot. So this is the proportion of trees that are in one of these categories. And what we kind of were thinking about is that these really large trees, so trees over 20 inches in dBH, they are kind of representing this legacy investment, where if a tree got big, it had to have been planted a long time ago. And here you can see that in blue and green line neighborhoods, we have many more of these than we do in C and D neighborhoods. Small trees, on the other hand, are kind of what the city is doing now. Like, where is the city choosing to plant trees? And so here you can see that the red line neighborhoods are getting a lot of new trees planted, which is great. And so we can also kind of analyze the occupancy patterns and sort of confirm this. So basically, we have 9 times fewer large trees in red line neighborhoods. They're just not there. Whereas small trees, we actually have the greatest chance of having a small tree in one of these previous red line neighborhoods. So we thought this was very positive news. Baltimore is actively planting a lot of trees in neighborhoods that had been not invested in. So the focus is on small trees here. And the one problem we did find when we look at the communities is that we are getting much lower species diversity that's being planted in these neighborhoods. So yes, we're putting a lot of trees in, but we tend to not be planting that many different types of trees. So maybe only about 20 types of trees total. And these, you can kind of dive into a little more of the community analysis to try to figure out what's going on. And basically in the red line neighborhoods, as you move from neighborhood to neighborhood, we have the same species being planted over and over again. And this is kind of what this looks like in terms of species reordering and species turnover. So, lower species turnover, lower species reordering. And what is driving this, it turns out, is this is a species rank abundance curve. And this is just the rank of kind of the species on the x-axis, and then the number of trees planted on the x-axis. And you can see in the A neighborhoods, this is a relatively flat line. So we're planting lots of species and about the same numbers of each of them. In these red line neighborhoods, we have a very uneven line here. And this means that we're planting a ton of a single species. The same species is the most commonly planted, Acer rubrum, this is red maple, in both of these neighborhood types, but we're planting about 1,000 versus about 50 in these previously red line neighborhoods. So we got the same species being planted again and again. And so this got us thinking that, you know, in a lot of ways, it's great that we're planting new trees, but we need to make sure that we're not creating a feedback that leads to inequitable kind of tree survival in these neighborhoods. Because one of the things that we know is already on the horizon for red maple and many of our street trees is this guy. This is Asian longhorn beetle. It's an invasive species that we currently have outbreaks of in South Carolina and in New Jersey. And loves red maple. So if we say, imagine all these newly planted communities that are filled with newly planted trees, and this species comes in, they're going to differentially affect those previously red line neighborhoods. So the summary of this is basically that we have this, we can see this past pattern of policy in our current street tree communities. And it's great that Baltimore is investing these trees in these areas, but we might need to actually think carefully about what we're planting, and are there ways that we can try to diversify the plantings or change and modify where these street trees are going in so that they have a greater chance of survival and we can plant a greater diversity of species. And if we aren't able to do that, we could be in trouble because these ecological feedbacks could really reinforce disparity in kind of the diversity of trees, but also the long-term health of the tree canopy cover in these neighborhoods. And it could create lower resilience to future climate stress, for example. This was a correlational study, so we don't know what's driving these patterns. I'm happy to talk more about it. But there's a lot of different actors that are making tree planting decisions, but also we could have differential survival happening across these neighborhoods. And we have, there's a grad student who's working kind of on answering this question, what's going on with these young trees across these neighborhoods right now. So we have immediate policy implications for this. Because we are actively planting a lot of trees in Maryland. There's a 5 million tree planting plan, but 500,000 of them are supposed to be in these urban areas and underinvested in areas. So the goal is to kind of integrate some of this integrated pest management thinking and diversification into some of these planting plans. All right, so the summary here is that we are actively trying to increase our tree canopy in a lot of areas because there's a wider recognition that this is really important for human health and community health. But I think in general, we have to remember that when we're doing any type of ecological work, restoration work, conservation work in cities, each neighborhood has a history that can potentially have impacts on the success of any potential conservation or restoration process that you undergo. And so you might need to actively consider this when you are making your plans for planting and talking through and engaging kind of with communities to increase the survival of these plantings. All right. So those were kind of I guess I talked about only 2 of those vignettes. But the summary here is that a lot of the choices we make as humans probably are going to have impacts on insect communities, but also the building of these food webs that are really important for these insects. And so I think that these landscapes are really challenging for insects, but hopefully I've convinced you that they're also really useful opportunities for thinking about how we can manipulate our practices to increase diversity in these landscapes. And with that, I'd like to thank a ton of folks who contribute to this. The 3rd vignette was really done with folks in the Baltimore Ecosystem Study. The quarterly meeting is tomorrow at Stillwater Church, and so if anybody wants to come, I encourage you. I know Sarah has done talks there before, but it's a really nice community of local folks thinking about ecology in Baltimore. So thanks, and I'll take any questions.
Yeah. So for the going to the tree stuff, some of the actors I noticed was things like plant availability in nurseries and stuff like that. But regardless of that, it seems like there's more diverse trees being planted in green neighborhoods and then just basically maples and the other ones. Why do you think that difference might be there?
Yeah, we've been thinking about that a lot. I will say that there's probably decreased initial survival right after planting in some of these areas that have really small tree pits. So there are differences in the soils that these trees are encountering, in the size of the tree pit. We've changed things about these neighborhoods that make them less hospitable to plants. So the master student who's doing this is seeing that some species are doing more poorly in previously redlined kind of neighborhoods. But on top of that, you have probably a lot of openings all at once on the landscape, and like they're going in and doing these big planting campaigns, and they need a ton of trees all at once, and availability is going to kind of dictate that they probably aren't going to be able to plant as much as if you were planting, say, 10 trees a year in a neighborhood. Then maybe you might plant 10 different species, or you plant 10 of one species one year, 10 the next year. But if you're going in and planting 300 trees all at once, it's often hard to get a diverse palette. And a lot of these are being sourced from kind of a common Baltimore appropriation of trees. So they place an order for like 300 species of trees all at once. So the tree supply chain is really complicated and probably plays a role in this. Also, some of these areas are getting redeveloped, and developers in particular tend to go in and they like to plant single species groups. And so I think that's also what's happening with some of this, is that they don't tend to plant as diversely as some of these tree planting organizations will.
I'll ask a follow-up to that because it's an interesting question, and it's one that's come up when we worked with Fairfax County and the forestry department there as well. And part of the issue is like differential survival. Easter does better, right? I mean, or they, at least initially, they survive a year or two. But the conversation often with them too was, well, how much diversity do I need, right? And so, I didn't have good answers when I was working with them, and most of the people in the room didn't. And so, I mean, what are your thoughts about, what do we tell municipalities? I mean, do we say, oh, we should go and look at this plot over here? Is, where are we gauging our market on that?
Yeah, for community groups that we've been working with, so we've been working with kind of the community groups who are getting grants to plant some of these urban tree projects. I like to ask them about at what point would they still consider their planting a success if they lost like a couple species, right? So if, say, something came through and had a disease or whatever and you lost that species from your planting, like would you still consider it a success? And I think that can be useful at the local scale. I think the problem with all of these sort of, like you'll hear, 10 or 5, 10, 30 rules where you don't want to have more than 20% of a single family, 10% of a single genus, 5% of a single species. And that might be like a good broad brush thing for the city, but right, like you can imagine in a city, you could plant each of your species like in a neighborhood and then you lose like each of that species in a neighborhood. So the distribution of the trees matters. And so I think that it's really about what level of risk you're comfortable with. And to me, it seems like if in these high risk areas or high stress areas, we can plant as diversely as possible, we'll be in the best shape and distribute them kind of around. So that's the work that Maggie's doing right now, is trying to figure out which native species do the best in these really challenging neighborhoods, and we're getting some surprising answers, actually. Some things we thought did well, like actually Acer rubrum not doing as well as we would have thought. We're just planting a ton because the mantra is it does well. Things like sweet gum actually are doing quite well. Willow, some of our oaks that I didn't really expect to be doing well are doing better than thought. Swamp white oak, for example, is doing better than red maple. So I think that we haven't taken on the ground data, and then everybody is just sort of left to take their anecdotes and try to figure out, and anecdotes are really important, right? But I think that we have narrowed our focus because of not having data on some of these things.
I think we're going to have to stop.
Yeah, we're
right
going
there,
to take
guys.
the next question outside.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.